Check out this mystical cabinet. It'll open when you wave a magical wand at it. Brilliant. First off, I need the wood to do the work, so the first thing I'm going to do is rip this railway sleeper down into usable timber. I don't have a bandsaw and I don't have a blade big enough to rip the sleeper in one pass, so I'm going to have to just cut her in half, then on one side and then flip it over and finish the cut on the other side. This will introduce a little unevenness on the face of the board. This can be tidied up with some sanding, or if it's particularly bad, some planing. I'm going to save myself some time and run each board through the thicknesser to get them nice and consistent. I ended up with about 5 or 6 lengths at 2x3, 2x4-ish. With some timber to play with, the next step is to make the boxes that the herbs are going to sit in. I cut all the pieces for the box from 2 lengths of 1x4 that I had lying around the shop. Each box used 3 long planks and 2 small squares on the ends, and some plastic stapled in to keep the dirt and moisture in. I decided to try and do this with as few screws as I could, relying simply on glue to get the majority of the job done, which means sticking with simple butt joints isn't really going to do the trick. It might, but it won't be a very strong joint, and considering this is for outdoors, I want it to be somewhat strong. I went with the idea of cutting rebates into the longer panels to have a stronger joint when it's time to glue, and to make it easier to hold the whole box together when it came to clamping up. To make this rebate, I made 2 cuts into each piece. Instead of constantly changing the table saw settings, I ran the 1 cut through all 6 pieces first, changed the blade and fence, and then made the final 6 cuts. It turns out I didn't quite cut them right and left this little extra strip in the corner of the cut. To take care of this, I got out my trusty chisel and poked them off. Next, I drilled some holes in the base piece for drainage using a small force and a bit. I added 3 holes in the base, spread evenly. Once the plastic's in place, we'll poke holes in the plastic near the holes to make sure the drainage is adequate. Before assembling the box, I added the plastic lining to make stapling it in much easier. I figured once the box was fully assembled, getting a staple gun in those awkward angles wasn't going to be fun. In hindsight, I'm not entirely convinced this was the best approach because I still had a lot of faff to get the plastic lined up and placed in the right place. And it turns out I didn't quite get the measurements correct anyway, so I ended up with too much in there. I think if I did it again, I'd go with fitting the plastic after the box was assembled and deal with the difficult stapling instead. If you have any tips on effective box clamping, by the way, let me know down in the comments below. This was a bit of a pain to put together. With the plastic stapled in, it's now time for gluing the box together. I'm using some outdoor Gorilla Glue here, ensuring it reaches all the way into the rebates. I wrapped the whole thing up in my box straps and cranked it down. Most if not all of the joints were quite tight, so I went around and took the worst of the glue off and let them dry. Unfortunately, I only have the 1 box clamp, so I had to wait 3 days for all the boxes to dry. So while we're waiting for those to dry, let's take a look at the legs. I decided I wanted a herb ladder that had a supporting set of legs. Sometimes you'll see these online where they're just ladders itself leaning against the wall. But I don't fancy the idea of that thing slipping in the wind or by rude introduction to animals or kids. So to make this thing nice and stable, I cut the base and the back to be flush with the floor and the wall. I also thought about how to connect the legs to the sides. In the end, I decided to push myself a little and attempt my first half-lap joints. Half-lap joints are straightforward enough. You carve out a hole in 2 pieces of timber, the same width as each other but only half the depth. So once you join them, they look like they're kind of going through each other. Kind of. Once I'd cut the feet off the sides, I laid the pieces on the table, to try and figure out where the supporting legs needed to go. I wanted to put it high enough for stability, but not so high that they would bump into the wall. So once I found the spot, I marked it out, ready to cut the half laps. I'm going to cut these half laps out on the table saw. I'm going to make a lot of passes to carve out the joint, so it's a good time to practice my often short patience. I made a cut on either side of the marked out area and then worked on carving out the guts of the joint. This would have been easier to do if I had a table sled, but I don't, so I had to make do with a mitre gauge to keep it straight and a steady grip to try and stay close to the lines. Not the best results, but it got me most of the way there. Next time, I'll use a table sled. Doing these half laps on the table saw will leave a lot of gruff behind that needs cleaning up. A short appointment with a nice sharp chisel should do the trick. I'm making sure to keep the back of the chisel flat to the piece to keep it as flat and even as I can. And this was a little disappointing. I fit the joints together and they were quite loose. I'm glad I didn't cut all of them at the same time, so for the next ones I cut them smaller than I needed and crept up on the line instead of just cutting up to the marked size straight away. I feel like if you have to thump the joint together, it's a good sign. I'm much happier with how tight this second joint is. Lesson learned. With the half laps done, I realised that I don't like or want the ends of the legs to be sticking through to the other side. So I cut them off and got them ready to glue together. I realise now that this decision means that cutting the half laps would have been a lot easier if I decided this at the beginning. Planning is important and it's something I rarely do. After cutting those ends off, we can see the state of these half lap joints. They're not quite deep enough into each other to be flush, and one of them's sticking out a little bit while the other is sticking in. Either way, they're not quite the right size. I was definitely planning for expansion and contraction as this thing's going to live in the elements. And it's gluing time again. Same story here as with the boxes, just lots of outdoor Gorilla Glue and clamping them together overnight. With the boxes dried, I'm just going to go refine the hole and then stab a little hole through the plastic to let the water drain through. Next up is the dry assembly. I mounted the boxes onto the legs with screws from the inside of the box. Just take a quick note on my notepad here. 400, yeah, okay. I used one screw per side to let me rotate the boxes a little, and I spaced them out equally to make it look nice. It was only when I was editing the video did I realise I could put the whole thing face flat on the floor to make assembly easier. This is probably the best part of recording yourself making things up as you go along. And here's a sneak peek of the final build. And now it's time to stain the thing. I'm using Cuprinol UV Guard Deck Protection Oil in Natural Oak. Why use decking oil for a herb ladder? Because it's what I had on hand and it's an outdoor wood oil that has a nice colour. In hindsight, I did a pretty horrible job at this part, so pay attention to what not to do. I forgot to sand down the boards at any point, especially after gluing, so once the stain was on, the glue repelled it, making it look very splotchy. I also made the mistake of thinking I could just load up my brush and go to town on the boards. This had the effect of pooling the oil in certain areas, making the boards darker in some spots and lighter in the rest. I was supposed to take long, slow sweeps to ensure not much oil pooled in one area for too long. I'm not gonna lie, I went into this part of the project a little short-tempered, so I rushed through it without paying much attention to what I was doing, and it shows. So learn from my mistakes. All in all, I put 2 layers of stain on these boxes with a few hours of dry time in the sun between each application. And that's the project finished. I really like the back legs for the support and the fact the sides are flush with the floor and the wall. This thing isn't going anywhere. I did make plenty of mistakes on this one, but what's a good woodworking project without mistakes? Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, it helps me out a lot. If you have any questions or comments, then let me know down in the comment section below so I and others like me can learn more. Take it easy, and I'll see you next time.